Hi, and welcome to the Luminaries In and Out of Sect podcast, a show about the moon and how astrologers embody and relate to it. My name is SP Hall, and I'm your host. Today, I have a special episode for you about the sign of Cancer through the houses for each rising sign. I spoke with the wonderful Lindsey Turner, who many of you likely know online as Bad Pastor. We had some challenges with our internet during the recording, and there were also some muffled noises in the recording that were a bit challenging to edit out. I just want to apologize for that. I hope it's not too disruptive or distracting or what have you. In addition, we also talk about some sensitive topics in this conversation, so here's a bit of a heads up on that. We talk about death as it relates to meaning in life, and we also touch on my recent grief around the loss of my pet. So if these are sensitive subjects for you, I would please proceed with caution. As always, if you enjoy the work that I'm doing on the podcast, please contribute to its sustainability by becoming a supporting member or offering a one-time donation on my website. There you can also find information on my services. I'm offering needle and horary consultations in addition to a timing consult that I recently launched. I also offer transcription, captioning, and audio and video editing. Thanks again to all those that have offered their generous support. I really appreciate you. Now for my conversation with Lindsey. I hope you enjoy it. Please be sure to check the links to their website and socials below, as well as links to some of the resources that we touch on in our conversation. Okay, Lindsey, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast today on this not so early Sunday morning. I don't know, it's kind of early for me a little bit, but yeah, it's a pleasure to meet you, and thanks for being here.
It's so nice to meet you too. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited about our conversation today.
Yeah, absolutely. First curveball question: How's the Mercury Kazemi for you in your 10th? Yeah, that was yesterday, I believe. We're recording on July 2nd.
Yeah, it was funny because I was sort of waiting for what's this going to be about, or maybe it's not going to really be about anything. And then last night I just got the urge to jump to Mastodon finally. I've been sort of gnashing my teeth over it, mostly because and we'll get into this, right? As a Cancer sun, these sort of like migrating homes, or is really challenging for me, and I
Mm,
get kind of freaked out by it. Like, where am I? What's the context? Who's in here? Is it safe?
mm,
How do I log in? What's the deal with all these servers? I don't know. So
yeah.
I think many folks made that same move. I think that was a big expression of the Mercury Kazemi. Yeah, and in Cancer, having that sort of quality of home base and preservation of memory and those sorts of things.
Yeah, absolutely.
How
It-
about
It's it,
you?
um yeah, I just want to say first it's like an interesting manifestation of the Mercury Kazemi. I don't know like Twitter's chart, but like Twitter kind of maybe is dead now as a
Mm.
result of or coinciding with the Mercury Kazemi, and that's why people are finding other places to go like Mastodon or you know I mean most people are, I think, are on Instagram as well, but yeah, it's really really interesting. For me, yeah, it's been a little tough. I'm a Sag rising, so Cancer is my eighth house, and there's associations with the eighth house with death, and our cat went missing about a month ago, and my partner had me do a horary on it, and there were some negative significations in the chart, but there was some hopeful things too, and I was trying to really like keep hope alive that he would return, but it seems like um yeah, it seems like it might be, uh, he might not be coming back. So it's been a lot of kind of coming to the realization that that might be the reality, over the last few days. And we had a particular event the day before the Kazemi that kind of like brought that home, which I won't get super into because it's a long story. But yeah, that's kind of what my experience was, and just kind of grieving and remembering him, and um yeah, kind of coming to that place of like, okay, this might be the reality.
Mm.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. That's really sad, SP. I'm really sorry.
Yeah, thank you, I appreciate that.
Yeah. Pets are really important and special.
Yeah, absolutely. And we had a really, like I can have a strong connection with animals anyway, but we had like a special bond. And so, yeah, it's definitely been quite sad, but it's interesting with the kind of like dark house connections too, where it's like I had an experience last night of like feeling like maybe he was still here with us. And
Mm.
so that was really nice and comforting. And I think that having an eighth house ascendant ruler, you kind of have to deal with just the reality of death in all its ways. The finality of it, the grief, but also the beauty and meaning that can come with having that connection. You
Right,
know.
right. Yeah, I've had some big deaths in recent years, and something that I read really moved me, that we can still get to know those who have passed by the quality of their absence.
Mm,
And I just loved that phrasing, and it gave me a lot of comfort because it's not a platitude, right? I mean, it's an
hmm.
acknowledgement that there's loss and that there's absence, and yet there's still relationship even in the midst of that loss and absence.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's kind of gets me into the weird thought of like nothing being thing, which feels kind of like a Zen koan a little bit because nothing is nothing, and but it I think can have a positive effect on us, or we can experience it as a thing unto itself, the absence of things. And so yeah, I think that that's really spot on. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. To get into it a little bit, do you want to offer us just an introduction to yourself and your practice? Where you're coming from in terms of your personal history and your philosophical perspective on astrology.
Yeah, absolutely. I was really excited. No one's ever asked me what my philosophical perspective is, and I was really, I mean, it would be a Sag rising who would ask that, but I was really like chuffed to be asked. So thank you
I love
in
that.
advance. So my name is Lindsey Turner. I use they them pronouns, and folks might know me as Bad Pastor on social media. And just a little like contextualization of who I am, where I am. I live in New Mexico on a communal orchard. I live with my husband, which is a term I learned for ex-husband, which I really like, who's like my best friend in the world, and my romantic partner and a couple of our friends. And we have met in total 5 on the property, maybe some more to come. And my next door neighbors have cows that I like to pretend are my pets too.
Amazing. I love
I
that.
had the it was so funny, and they came a first quarter moon in Taurus. It was so cute, and they were just babies, and I got to watch them meet each other, and it was
Mm,
one of their first experiences meeting another cow, and it was
wow.
so cool. And they play like dogs. I had no idea. I'm learning so much about
Uh-huh.
cows, and they're super friendly. And one of them licked me, and they have these massive tongues that are really rough, almost like a cat tongue.
Mm,
It just they're really cool animals. So that's sort of my day to day is in in this valley on this orchard. I do lots of building projects and renovating, and I don't share as much about that on social media, but it takes up quite a bit of time. Um, and I've had a sort of multifaceted, multiphasic career. So I was a government major in college, and I worked for the Obama campaign in 2008. And then I worked for the Obama administration in DC the
oh
first
wow.
4 years. And I ended up transitioning. I got super depressed
Mm,
and ended up transitioning, having sort of a spiritual awakening, and really on a whim applied to Union Theological Seminary. Got in. I applied like on a Friday and got in the next Monday, sort of thing.
amazing.
And as I was telling you before we started, I had not gone to visit the place, but I just
Hmm.
moved there, truly on a wing and a prayer. And it was like 3 of the best years of my life doing a Master of
Mm,
Divinity there. And I studied art and worship and theology. That was my main thrust, and
amazing.
ritual theory, which a lot of people don't even know there's a discipline called ritual theory.
Hmm.
And then after I graduated, I graduated just before the previous Venus retrograde in Leo, and sort of fell like ass backwards into church ministry. I had actually been planning on doing sort of entrepreneurial arts and ritual ministry, but then this job opened up through a series of connections, and I ended up going to work for a congregational church in New Jersey, where I worked with children primarily, or like teenagers. I loved it. I loved it, and did a lot of also like adult education and stuff, and anti-racist work, and environmental and faith work, and just kind of trying to help give people like a political lens for their theology as well.
Amazing.
It was really fun until it wasn't. There was a change in leadership. This is a too common story. There's a change in leadership. They took issue with me for some unexplained never to be known reason, and kind of systematically pushed me out. And there was like the sort of big climax at the end of that was, I had offered a room to this like young adult in our congregation who was experiencing homelessness, and it just sort of exploded. But I have cancer in the 10th, and it all sort of in hindsight makes a lot of sense, right? That I was having a activation on that axis at the time, and it had something to do with housing and my career. And I ended up being forced to resign. It was actually 5 years ago yesterday that I was forced to resign. So I've been sort of recovering from that for a long time. It was also, that was happening concurrent to a huge tragedy. My best friend was murdered. She was murdered in a murder-suicide that ended up being this like international thing. They did a 2020 episode on it. It was really traumatic, and it was happening at the same time as all this. And I think that that's true for a lot of people when they experience like one sort of tragedy, like there's other things happening too at the same time. And so, I say all that just to kind of contextualize my practice, which is really, I was lucky during the pandemic. I was on uninsurance employment, and I was able to really educate myself and learn from others about astrology. And I hadn't really put my interest in astrology and my interest in faith and theology together until a couple of years ago, when I was sort of had this introduction to traditional astrology, like via Chris Brennan, and realized, oh my God, this stuff's coming out of the same time and place. The Mediterranean basin 2,000 years ago. This is in the cultural context, both astrology and, Judaism, and this sort of like new kind of faith coming through. And so for me, sort of cemented my practice of being like a practice of witnessing or bearing witness, because it's actually the same word that I think maybe it's Ptolemy used, like the stars witness each other, is the same Greek word for like martyr or to bear witness. And I thought that was so poetic and beautiful to imagine the planets, the stars, not only bearing witness to each other, but bearing witness to our lives. Yes. And then being able to myself bear witness through that practice to other people, including the tragedy and the grief, which is often why people come to astrology or astrologers. Something is happening, and it's very uncomfortable or very tragic. So that's one of my sort of philosophical or maybe even theological perspectives, frameworks of witness. And I would say also, my seminary education was in the school of thought of liberation theology, which is this idea that God or the divine is on the side of the oppressed, and that faith can and should liberate those who are disenfranchised. And so I think those are probably the two biggest hermeneutics, which is a fun theological word, or like lens through which I view my astrological practice.
I'm thinking back to my my undergrad experience, and studying cross-cultural philosophy and studying hermeneutics, actually, which is like the study of understanding how we understand things. And
Mm.
your mention of liberation theology reminded me of like my own kind of religious journey. And I went to a Jesuit university, and liberation theology, at least in the context of El Salvador, kind of like came. I think that into like kind of intellectually, it kind of came out of the Jesuits, although I don't remember correctly. It's been a long time since I've really been up on the history, but anyway, I remember, to make a long story short, I remember I was very religious in college, and to the extent that I was considering going to the seminary myself, like Jesuit seminary. And I remember studying abroad my junior year in college and going to St. Peter's and like witnessing how ornate that church, like that basilica was. And the story about that basically is that St. Peter's basically like stole all the marble from the surrounding city of Rome, and like built this incredibly ornate church. And when I graduated from college, I went to El Salvador on kind of like a mission trip, what have you. We went and we learned about different community organizations that were operating. We learned about the history of the country. We met with like the Arena and the other political party. We met with them and kind of learned about what they were doing politically in the country at the time. And we went to mass in this parking lot, basically. Like it was like basically just four concrete walls that like was used for cars to park in. And the priest that had delivered the mass had been excommunicated from the church because of his quote unquote political activity,
Mm.
which was basically advocating for the poor, the campesinos. And because there was a mining company that came in that was poisoning the river that, tons of people in El Salvador relied on for drinking water and everything. And, so, yeah, I feel a lot of resonance with your description of your own theological perspective, and kind of like the emphasis on bearing witness and solidarity. And yeah, it's like I don't think that God, like I found God more in that drab concrete structure in El Salvador than I did at this incredibly beautiful or ornate church in Italy.
Mhm.
And so yeah, I'm just evoking a lot of memories right now. So thank you for sharing about
Yeah,
your experience.
yeah, my pleasure. It's quite the juxtaposition of images, and
Yeah.
I think that that is such a great, um, signaling to how people are wrestling in the church, right? With we have on one hand we have this image, and on the other we have this image, and what is the church really? What is the faith
Hmm.
um, really kind of manifesting through?
Yeah, I came home from that experience, and in Catholicism, I had been wrestling with this idea of like, I can't even think of the idea, but the kind of centrality of fearing God as a part of loving God.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and like, I came home and I was just like, I can't believe in a God like this anymore.
Yeah.
Where like the central thing of love is fear. And it just reminds me of what you said about the planets bearing witness, or like the gods bearing witness, and how comforting it feels to, um, for me at least, to think of divinity as something that helps us find comfort and meaning in the times when challenging things happen, rather than this kind of idea of like everything happens for a reason, or
Mm-hmm.
um, what have you. It's like bad things don't happen because like God makes it happen, but because of my experiences, because of like a relationship with God, I can find meaning in those challenges.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that, like reversal that you're doing there. And I think it's really, and I'm just drawing a comparison to between our charts where you have Jupiter in Cancer in the eighth, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And I have a Jupiter in Pisces in the sixth.
Mm.
And since we're talking about Cancer today and thinking about Jupiter's exaltation, you have Jupiter in exaltation, I have it in domicile. in these water signs that are those houses don't bear witness, right, to the first house, and so they're considered these like dark houses. And so I think it's really potent that we're having this conversation and that sharing this perspective of like, or questions of what does it mean to really bear witness, what does it mean to like really bring spirituality and God into an astrological practice, and what does it mean to do that in a way that honors the questions that never get answered, the griefs that go, unaddressed or unseen, the inequities that get shoved under the rug.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. Thanks for bringing it back to astrology.
Full circle.
Yeah.
You can always bring it back with astrology, I think.
Yeah. So I'd love to hear just briefly your thoughts on the moon in astrology and what you think it means. And yeah.
So I heard Jason Hawley said this like one-off thing about the moon one time that has always stuck with me. And he called it a record of impacts. And I loved that because I think I love when we get to use metaphors that really describe the physical nature of the planets as well as their spiritual nature. And the moon being this body that's really close to us, that has all these craters, right? It reflects light. It's not perfect. And it's consistently inconsistent, right? And so it has this, to me, the signification of ephemerality in the passage of time. And I really love the idea that the moon serves as a prism that sort of filters all the planetary energies, into our bodies when we're born, and that it's, she's sort of the last stop for all the energies to get intermixed and mingled.
Love that. I love the note that you put, kind of rephrasing Jason's comment as a ledger of blows. I feel like there's a poetic quality to that feels really poignant. Yeah. Tell me what you think about the sign of Cancer. What does Cancer mean to you?
So I think Cancer really gets overlooked or sort of like glossed over a lot as just sensitive.
Yeah.
And I actually did a whole webinar on this last weekend about, I think that a better word might be responsive, because sensitive has really developed this connotation, I think, culturally of weak or somehow like defective. And I think that there's a reason for that. This is like a cultural analysis of power, but I think that in order to survive, right, what I would call these like pillars of empire, like racism, militarism, patriarchy, capitalism, we have to cut ourselves off from other people's experiences of those things in order to sort of like preserve, which might be a shadow side of Cancer, right? And I'm thinking of the United States of America being a Cancerian, right? And the sort of, on one hand, this grandiose philosophical idea that like it's a home for everyone, right? And then on the other hand, this kind of, but like if there's shadow, if there's suffering, we can't acknowledge it. We have to be cut off from it and from one another. And so I think reframing Cancer not necessarily as sensitive, which it can be, but responsive, of actually having a response to stimuli, right? To suffering, to need, even just a response to someone's existence, right? I mean, relationships are what make us human. If we didn't have other people to mirror back to us who we are and what we are, we wouldn't exist, maybe. Like, in a like kind of psychological sense. So yeah, I think of Cancer primarily as a sign of responsiveness, and also as a sign of survival and evolution. One of the things that I love talking about with Cancer is this concept, or like phenomenon, of carcinization, which is where the crab keeps evolving. Like in like its own independent instances, the crab keeps evolving. And one of the ideas behind that is that the crab is like the ideal form for
Hmm.
survival. It can jump, it can run, it can swim, it can climb. It doesn't have a big juicy tail like a lobster that predators want to eat. It has claws and a hard shell for protection. It can scavenge. It can eat, debris and detritus at the bottom of the water. I mean, it's a really good survivor, and so things keep evolving into it. And I think that's such a beautiful metaphor for cancer as well, as it's really good at preserving itself. And so I think of, yeah, preservation, self-preservation, but also preservation of memory too, which kind of gets
Mm,
back into the moon, because I think the moon is like when we look at the moon, we're looking at a memory of the sun's light.
right.
And so I think that, that sense of memory comes into play too with cancer.
It's wonderful. It's just interesting to think about this term that you used of like over time species evolving to be similar to the crab, and what you started with like the term the responsiveness, or what comes to mind as well as attentiveness, which is a little bit different, but it's interesting to think about sensitivity as like an evolutionary thing as well. I can't quite make the connection in this moment, but there feels like some kind of connection of evolution of species into the crab, and a kind of evolution towards attentiveness and responsiveness, because it's like how do we survive in a changing environment by knowing how it's changing and
Yes.
acting accordingly.
Yes. Yeah, that perception is so important.
Hmm.
How can you adapt if you don't know what you're adapting to?
Right.
I also really love to think about cancer. So in theology, we have this apophatic school of thought, where it's basically like you can't say what God is, but you can say what God isn't, and
Mm,
that's how you can sort of like get to know, is like a negation, basically. So thinking about the signs that are in aversion to cancer also helps me kind of understand cancer better. So Gemini and Leo, Sagittarius and Aquarius, and to me, those four signs they have a sort of external or like extroverted quality to them, in a way of like, going out and exploring, or putting oneself out there, or figuring out a new system, right? Or like traveling around the world. And in contrast, Cancer is really like, I think I would just prefer to stay at home in my pajamas.
hmm.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting too to think about the kind of antisha contra antisha relationships that Cancer has as well, because I do see with antisha and like the sharing of light between Gemini and Cancer, there does seem like a kind of affinity there.
Mhm.
And there seems like a kind of affinity between Cancer and Sagittarius as well. At least in my experience as like again, as a Sag rising with Jupiter and Cancer. But I do think that Cancer and Aquarius, there really does seem like not even oppositional quality, because it's not an opposition. It's like, what do we refer to that? Just something that's completely different, but in a way that uh, feels very, very foreign and parallel almost. Um,
Mhm.
it's like, yeah, I think that there's like a centrality to Cancer that speaks to that responsiveness and that attentiveness. And then with Aquarius, there feels like this, like standing at the edge, being able to see a whole view. But yeah, it's a very different kind of perception, I think.
Yeah, yeah. One of my very best friends has Aquarius sun and moon. And, you know, I help them like pick out pillows and stuff for they're like, I don't know, Lindsay. I don't know what I'm doing, right? I'm helping them design their new kitchen. This is sort of, you're gonna want to have your stove here and some prep space there, and they are like, come on, we're gonna go out on the river and we're gonna get on the paddleboard, and I'm like, what we're gonna do? It's so like, I'm like, that gives me anxiety in a way, because I'm like, this is so unfamiliar to me, but
Mm,
there's like this really complementary energy in our friendship, where yeah, we can sort of help fill in each other's like ignorances.
that's awesome. All right, yeah, let's get into talking about the sign of Cancer through the houses and each of the rising signs. Shall we start with Cancer, or where would you like to start with that?
We can start with Cancer.
Awesome.
Absolutely. I love just thinking about people that I know, right? Because
Hmm.
there's such a familiarity. I have a good friend from seminary who has Cancer rising, and he's a climate organizer, and he's a trans man and a seahorse dad. So
Mm,
I just think that is a really cool expression of having Cancer in the house of self, as doing nurturing and like bearing life,
hmm.
even in a world that might be like, no, you're not allowed to do that. And I also think of Octavia Butler, who had Cancer rising,
Yeah.
and
My
and
neighbor,
her kind of,
Octavia.
she was your neighbor.
She's not my neighbor, but she famously lived in Pasadena, which is like kind of
Oh,
near where we live. Yeah.
oh, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's this essence of Cancer rising that I've encountered of like, I'm going to do my best to try to save the world, right? And it's
Mm,
realistic. In my experience, it's not, it isn't like fluffy in nature.
hmm.
It's really like, these are the things that we need to do to save the world, and these are the steps I'm going to take to do them. And it's a real act and practice of vulnerability in my mind
Hmm.
to even try, to even care enough to try, right? When the odds are just like so against us in our efforts to
Hmm.
save the world, whatever that means. Yeah. Do you have
Yeah.
experiences of Cancer rising?
Yeah, and I just want to say for listeners who maybe like aren't familiar with the houses, like like what each of the houses means, but maybe I will do some kind of link. I know Chris Brennan on the Astrology Podcast has done some great like house episodes. Each of the houses has its own meanings, and so just like anything else, like I'm just thinking about the relationship of the first house to different houses, kind of like we just spoke about, like the aversions with Cancer. And I can't help but think about kind of what you spoke or alluded to a little bit earlier with the relationship between Cancer and Pisces, and how for Cancer risings, Pisces is the ninth house. And so there's this very strong Jupiterian element with Cancer being the exaltation ruler, or Jupiter being the exaltation ruler of Cancer and the domicile ruler of Pisces in the ninth house. And so there being this very, kind of watery emotional association with like worldview and philosophy, and how that relates to embodiment. And so that's just really interesting to consider.
I love that connection. Yeah, thinking of Jupiter and what it's kind of connecting or weaving together in the chart.
Hmm. Yeah. And the next
Yeah, that
guest
ninth
for
house grandiosity.
yeah, absolutely. The next guest, I'm not sure if I'm going to release this episode first or the other Cancer Moon episode first, but Jared, who is my Cancer Moon, with like the moon as the luminary out of Sect. He has the Cancer rising as well. And so we really kind of explore his chart in that episode. So definitely suggest people give that a listen, as well.
Mm, beautiful.
Yeah, let's move on to Leo rising. So their Cancer would be the 12th house. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I have two friends with Leo rising, and they both do work with populations of people who largely go unseen.
Mm,
And I think that that's really a really powerful expression of the 12th house, of being the house of isolation. So one of these friends is a hospital chaplain. She actually has Mars in Cancer in the 12th house, and so she does direct care for
hmm.
people who are in the hospital, and she's also a teacher of chaplains. So I think that that's a really cool expression. And then my friend, actually, the one I just mentioned, who has Aquarius Sun and Moon, has Leo rising, and they have worked in prison settings, on crisis hotlines. Now they're doing a lot of advocacy work for trans folks, and like sexual health,
Mm,
and abortion access.
amazing.
And those are populations of people that are often not included in conversations about abortion access or sexual health.
Right.
And so yeah, I really see this Leonine. Let's like shine the light onto the dark places, and that's how
Hmm.
we show care, or how we respond.
Yeah, I love that. I love to hear how so interesting how those kind of 12th house significations come in that way, especially like, yeah, just thinking about marginalized populations, quote unquote. I use that I use that term a little with a little misgivings because I don't want to put that on anybody, but people who are um, a little bit more isolated, and how, like voting is an example. People who are convicted of a felony are not able to vote. And there is a kind of isolating component of that, like not being able to be included in the political process just because of something that may or may not have happened in their past. So it's really
Mm,
interesting to hear
yeah.
about that.
Yeah, voting is a form of self-expression, right?
Hmm. Yeah. All right. So how about for Virgo rising? So the 11th house would be Cancer in that situation.
Yeah. So I have to say I'm not terribly close with a lot of Virgo rising people, maybe because Virgo's my 12th house. But my impression, right, just kind of like thinking about it and maybe looking up some celebrities, right, who have Virgo rising, to have Virgo in the 11th house, right, is this sort of like taking care of one's friends, like just being
Yeah.
like the friend mom
Hmm.
almost.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
actually have a great example for this because my Aquarius moon guest, Justin Plunkett, has a Virgo rising. And so he talked a lot about it being in college and just the importance of his group of friends in college. And interesting to think about like Aquarius, as I said, as like a view from the edges, how like him and his group of friends were super tight, but they were kind of like the alternative crowd at the college. So they didn't quite fit in with everybody, but they had this kind of
Mhm.
supportive group together. And I feel like that kind of speaks to Virgo rising, 11th house Cancer, moon in Aquarius.
Mm, I love that. And I think you bring up something really important too about Cancer, or like the house that Cancer's in. I feel like sometimes there can be a sort of like a cultural conflict that emerges with that house, like those house topics. And I wonder if it is that sort of Cancerian impulse to kind of self preserve, right, and to hold on to what's familiar, right, which can sort of be incongruent with the
Hmm.
wider culture. I don't know. I'm just rapping here.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking too, like, yeah, I'm just kind of associating like for people in my age cohort who have Jupiter in Cancer, if they had Virgo rising, Jupiter would not only be exalted, but would be in the house of its joy. And so like there
Yes.
adds an even, different element to that as well, which is really interesting.
Yes. This sort of move of our generation, I think the like Pluto and Scorpio generation of making family out of friends.
Mm, yes.
And because so many of us have such like radically different philosophies and faiths and expressions of self than maybe like if we had boomer parents, right? It's like there's that square, that like Pluto and Leo generation and this
Right.
the Pluto and Scorpio generation of like, well, let's like do things differently, right? And so yeah, thinking of how might Cancer, that familial vibe, be expressed
Hmm.
in the generation that you and I are both a part of, is an interesting thing to think about.
Absolutely. And yeah, not to get kind of like sidetracked, but you said that you have Saturn in Sag, and so that's going to have a different flavor than, for example, like I have Saturn in Capricorn, and so there's
Mm.
this kind of oppositional nature between the very, as I said, I have like a Capricorn stellium, or maybe I said that before we started recording, but I have this Capricorn stellium, and so there's this like, and I have Jupiter in Cancer, and so that opposition is very important in my chart between like all of these planets in Capricorn and this ascendant ruler in Cancer. And so it's just interesting how that can play a role as well with how parenthood might manifest with like Saturn signification sometimes of the father, how different things, how home can maybe manifest in different ways or have some challenges associated with it.
Totally. I was reading, well, when we get to the Saturn ruled signs too, I'm sure this will come up, but was reading about Saturn and Cancer, piece that Alice Sparkley Cat wrote on that, and this sort of sense of like, well, I don't belong, or this like search for belonging, or maybe I don't want to belong to a tradition. I don't want to, like do
Mm-hmm.
this stuff, which, yeah, is interesting to think about those sort of micro generations of like where is Saturn, and how does it relate back to the Cancerian house, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
what is the relationship of belonging or not belonging, which is maybe like the big question that Saturn, as it relates to Cancer, asks.
Yeah, absolutely. Very interesting. Yeah, let's move on to Libra rising, which you are a Libra rising. So
Mm.
Cancer would be the 10th house. So tell us a little bit about your experience.
Yeah. So, I mean, public nurturing.
Mm,
Really, I mean, being a minister, being an astrologer, right? To my lens for those things are like, how do I care for people? And it
mm-hmm.
it is in this very public way, particularly because I also have Sun in Cancer,
Yeah,
and it's there's an interesting part of it too, of like your most kind of private parts of self, or like your family, or these things are sort of on display. I
right.
think with Cancer in the 10th, I mean, Libra rising has like an inversion of the chart, right? And so there is this, yeah, it's interesting, like the private becomes public. And that's very much been my experience of having a Cancer 10th house.
Interesting. Yeah, and I want to bring in I'm reminded of Demetra George's, basically I call it volume 2, but it has this long title, but it's basically her, most recent book about chart interpretation, and she talks about, how you basically interpret um the houses and planets and houses and whatnot. And one of the things she mentions is like the house that a planet rules determines how it will manifest in a chart, but also the house that the planet is placed. And so, I'm curious if we could bring in a little bit here your Leo moon and how that kind of adds an additional flavor to the experience of your 10th house Cancer.
Yeah, thank you for asking. Yeah, so I have an 11th house Leo moon co-present with Venus, which is my chart ruler. So
Mm,
there's quite a bit of emphasis in this area of my chart, and also Mercury, which is the planet closest to my midheaven and was about an hour from stationing retrograde when I was born. So for me, this is manifested as the some of the ways in which I offer this like public care is by assembling groups of people
mm,
and sort of stewarding friendships, and also creative projects. So some of my favorite expressions of this happened in seminary. I organized, like 40 people to put on a biblical Broadway review.
mm.
And so, it was that Leonine, like singing and dancing and acting. 11th house, like all my friends, all my colleagues, all my classmates.
Yeah.
But the sort of idea was to sort of was to get into some of these more difficult biblical texts and kind of reframe them, reinvent them, redeem them,
Mm,
and find yeah, that responsiveness from the text, to feel kind of cared for, by our faith and in community. And so that's to me how they're kind of like working together. But yeah, I think that
mm.
the house where the moon is, and the sign where the moon is really sort of it's like the vehicle. It's like it's what gets the Cancerian work done in the chart in a way.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, another thing I was struck by in Demetra's book was so one thing a friend of mine named Cameron Cassie, I'm not sure if you know Cameron, he'll kind of refer to planets that rule like quote unquote dark houses as like accidental malefics, which is a topic I've just been thinking about for a while since I first heard about it. So it's like the, second, eighth, 12th, sixth. And one of the things that Demetrius says is like the ruler of the 12th and the 10th could be actually a benefit because, but it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's like associations of the 12th house coming into the 10th. So I'm trying to think of how that could manifest. Like the first thing that comes to mind is like a corrections officer or something like that, or like a prison warden or something like that. But yeah, it's just really, really interesting to think about how a house manifests depending on where its ruler is and what that sign is and what that house is and all of that.
It really is. That's the stuff to me that makes astrology so juicy. It's not just the straightforward, placement in the sign house. It's like, how is everything pinging around the chart and creating
Right.
this really complicated and beautiful tapestry?
Yeah. It's like looking at like a spider's web. You're like, oh, this is so beautiful how this all comes together.
Yes.
All right, yeah, let's and this is another, I think the next rising sign is a really interesting example too, because we have Scorpio rising, the ninth house. So again, these associations with like philosophy, worldview, teaching, travel. Cancer falls there in the ninth house, and Cancer is the sign of Mars, quote unquote, fall. I'm not sure how you kind of refer to it. We're coming up with all this different language to refer to these different signs or dignities or what have you. But I think it's interesting when you have a rising sign, and then how does the sign where the planet who rules the rising sign manifest if it's a place that's not super dignified. I also think that that's really interesting too. So, do you have any thoughts about Scorpio rising and ninth house Cancer?
I do. I'm surrounded by Scorpio rising.
Amazing,
Like, I live with three of them.
cool.
We just got another Libra rising to come live on the property, so we're balancing out the
Mm.
the equation a bit. But
It's interesting
um,
too because for you that's your second house, and so it's kind of like self-resourcing, but it's like these people who can maybe like kind of be a kind of resource for you. I don't want to say it in a way that seems like extractive, but
no, but it's powerful because these folks are extremely independent. And I think the expression of having Mars as the ruling planet, right? Like Mars is very independent. It's a very like, I'm going to do it myself kind of planet. Doesn't really want to rely on others for care.
mhm,
And I think that's like an expression of Mars and its fall in Cancer, right? Is like, I don't want to be cared for, because if I'm being cared for, it means something's wrong, right? Like I'm
mm,
injured or I'm sick.
mm,
Um, and so I think, as someone who myself has like a very natural proclivity to care for people and to want to care, it's really
mhm.
nice to be around people who are like, no thanks. I got it.
Mhm,
And of course we have established these sort of ethics of care, which for me is a
mm,
Scorpio rising, ninth house Cancer keywords, right? Ethics of care. Um, we're very intentional about what does it look like to be in community? What does our sustainability look like? How do we own up for our mistakes? How do we help each other out when, like there's a like a shortage of resources or whatever. And so
mhm.
care gets sort of into the intellectual realm with these folks. And yeah, I think it is really neat to be like, what is the Marshall response to
Mhm.
care?
Yeah. I was just thinking as well as the episode I just released is with Amaya Rourke, and she has Scorpio rising with the moon in Cancer in the ninth, and she talks about the body as a source of wisdom,
Mm,
like the body as like the intelligence that comes from the body, and the body is almost like a place where um, intelligence can be tapped into. And I just thought that that was a really interesting literal manifestation of that.
yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
wonderful. Let's move on to my rising sign, Sagittarius. Interested to hear your thoughts on Sag.
Yeah. Yeah, thinking of this eighth house, right? And the eighth house emphasis on shared resources, right? We also have these significations of grief and death, but also the sort of death of one's own resources into the community. Um, and so, yeah, like thinking about community care in that context, like how do we share resources? And just recently I saw you posting, like it's really hard to live in this country, like
Yeah.
their attempted coup, go to work, right? Taking away your rights, go to work. And
Yeah.
just observing you, seeing you really framing like, how do we care as a community? We clearly don't, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like take care of each other as a community when these big shared events happen. And then my other thought on Sagittarius, and this is sort of like a question mark, and maybe you can answer that, but I think of Cancer as having significations of birth, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
having this sign of birth in the house of death, like maybe there this lens to seeing death as sort of a
Lindsay, you there?
yes, I am sorry. Where did you lose
No
me?
worries. I think death is birth is where like one of the last things I heard.
Sure. Yeah. So how do does that land with you? Do you see death as this sort of like passageway, right? Like a birth
Mm,
canal almost might be. Yeah. And then just what are your experiences having
yeah.
a cancer?
Yeah. I mean, I think my chart is a really complicated example, perhaps, because I have the moon and Mars pretty closely conjunct in Sag in my first, and then I have Jupiter in my eighth in Cancer, and so the moon and Jupiter are like sharing this generosity of being in each other's signs, and then Mars and Jupiter are actually are sharing kind of a generosity as well of being in each other's terms and triplicities. And so there's like a lot of exchange going on between the moon and Mars and Jupiter that feels very like immediate for me and very kind of visceral. And I think that, yeah, I very much think about the kind of dialect between life and death, like especially as it relates to how we create meaning. And I'm thinking back to my first philosophy class in college and reading the Iliad, and thinking about like I think it was the context of Achilles' death, and this kind of creation of a larger question of like, if we live forever, what does our life mean?
Mm,
It's like where do the gods find meaning? This kind of Olympian, these Olympian gods, how do they find meaning having to contend with their own immortality? And I'm reminded also of another book. I forget her name, but she wrote Circe, which is like a retelling of the story of Circe. And I remember there being a passage where she's kind of mourning her immortality because it means that she's kind of like isolated and doesn't have a relationship with God like the other gods, but can form these relationships with humans sometimes, and she has to contend with, um, I think it's even her child. She has to contend with the death of her child, and so it's interesting too because there almost seems like no matter who you are, it's inescapable, the
mm,
reality of life. And so I would say I think a lot about life and death and how it relates to meaning. And one of the questions that you raised in our notes, I kind of discussed briefly with Jared, is this idea of I forget where it is. I think it might be in Firmicus, where he talks about each rising sign in relation to the its eighth house, and kind of like that place being the death of the rising sign. So like the death of Jupiter is the moon, and it is really interesting with Jupiter being exalted in this place of its death. It's kind of like, yeah, it's like being held up in death. And I think a lot about how Jupiter might relate to legacy as a concept with the associations of exaltation and kind of holding up. So I'm just
mm.
curious if you have thoughts on that.
That's definitely something to mull over. I mean, just thinking about my ruling planet being Venus, which is also the lord of my eighth house.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Mm-hmm.
relationships being both like the life and the death of me.
Yeah. And it's so interesting for Libra risings because, yeah, your eighth is Taurus. And so, the planet that rules life also rules death.
Yeah, that's something new for me to think about. Thank you. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I think
Absolutely.
yeah, there's obviously some really fertile ground there to explore.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay, yeah, let's move on to the sign that is my second house. I have a lot of these people in my life. Interestingly, you were talking about having a lot of Scorpio risings in your life. I have a lot of Cap risings in my life.
So funny.
What's that?
It's just funny.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you think about Cap risings?
I have a few in my life and they're just they're just like these people are just tough as nails, funny,
Mhm.
funny as all get out. And I think what I have witnessed is that it's in partnership that they really relax. They like
Mhm.
really are sort of like, okay, I can be vulnerable here, right? I don't have to be so tough. I don't have to be so funny.
Mhm.
I can just like sort of be me, and be received, in partnership. And again, like this is a call back to Saturn's condition in Cancers, being in detriment. And what does that mean? Like what Ace was writing about, what does that mean for, belonging, and really like feeling comfortable being oneself in the
Mhm.
context of community or other people. Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you witness in Cap Risings?
Yeah, there is a very like, what's the word? Dyadism to cap risings, I think sometimes, where it's like very much about like there's like the individual and the other, and there's this like one and two, I think, with cap risings that feels really interesting in relation to like my partner is a Capricorn rising, but like I've met some of her friends, but like her relationships with her friends are very like things unto themselves, it seems, and then her relationship with me is like a thing unto itself. And it's like, you think about like the divisibility of Earth compared to other elements, and how,
Mm.
like we fence off sections of land, and it's really easy to kind of compartmentalize things. And it's interesting with the Capricorn rising how I feel like I've seen that kind of move into other territories as well, of their life. Whereas I think with myself, it's like I don't like compartmentalizing. I like everything to kind of come together and mix together, and that manifests in many ways in my life. And so, I'm not saying either thing is better or worse. It's just, yeah, something I have definitely observed with cap risings.
Yeah. Yeah. I would agree, right? It's like this goes here, this goes here, this goes here.
Hmm. Hmm. I don't want to do
Yeah.
that. I don't want to expose myself in front of those people. These are the people I trust. These are the people I want to communicate this thing to.
Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting. We keep kind of coming back to the eighth house, but maybe in this case, it's poignant because it's the other, it's the other like luminary sign, luminary ruled
Hmm.
sign, Leo, and the sort of like rulership of Saturn. And I think one of the things that makes Cap Rising so funny is the relationship with death becomes sort of like I laugh in the face of death,
Uh-huh.
like I make fun of it. I like shine light on it. It's nothing to me. And
Mm.
how that, there's, I think in partnership there is sort of like, okay, here's this little bit of space where I can like be scared.
Mm.
you,
Yeah.
where I can like show my soft underbelly, and it's like it's a safe thing to do.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's so funny. It makes me think about the difference between like Sag risings and Cap risings, where, what I just explained, where it's like, death is another thing to find meaning in, and it's like something to think about and really kind of like change in relation to, and like fuel to kind of live more more intentionally and whatnot. And for Cap risings, it could be like, with like the sun there, like it's like, yeah, it's just another thing to like make a joke about and like laugh about. It's just like any other part of life that's like kind of weird and absurd. Like, why not? Why not laugh at
Right. Yeah. Like, well, he's dead,
it?
okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I
I don't
love
know
Cap.
why, but Monty Python's Holy Grail is coming to mind, where like there's
Yes.
that scene where the guy keeps getting his arms chopped off. It feels like very like Capricornian humor. "'Tis just a flesh wound."
Yeah. Or Cocaine Bear. Did you see Cocaine Bear?
No, I haven't seen it.
It's just like gratuitous violence, but it's so funny.
Oh my gosh.
I loved it. Some people hated it, but I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I'll have to check that out. Yeah, another Saturnian sign, but a very different flavor. Aquarius rising. So there, Cancer is the sixth house. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about how Aquarius rising differs from Capricorn rising, with that same Saturnian element, but with the different house with Cancer.
Yeah. My partner's father has Aquarius rising, and he worked he and my partner's mother had a restaurant for like 40 years. And he did a lot of the like cooking, but he also turned it into this like huge art space.
Mm.
So that was, I mean, he also has a fifth house son. So there's that. But, you know, it struck me that there's a sort of like the revolution is in feeding people. Like the
Mm.
revolution is in radical care. The revolution is in, you know, like remembering and nurturing. And so this sort of like, you know, soft rebellion in a way. Kind of that's the
Mm-hmm.
kind of vibe it gives me. This, you know, I think the sixth house we associated a lot with illness and misfortune, but I also have really come to see people with sixth house placements as being very much in solidarity
Mm.
with people who are disenfranchised. And so, yeah, I really see that playing out with the Cancer in the sixth.
Mm. Yeah, that's really interesting. Just thinking about like that idea of what happens after the revolution. Like we still need to feed people. We still need to meet people's material needs. And I think with like the sustaining labor quality of the sixth house definitely can like come in that way of like, yeah, who's cutting the carrots and like who's doing these things that need to be done to maintain the life of
Mhm.
society or the people.
Yeah. Oh, I love, what did you say? Sustained labor?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's so good. Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking about 40 years having a restaurant. 40 years. That's a long
Mm.
ass time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. And the, you know, Aquarius being the water bearer, which is like
Mm.
classically, it's a quite simple job. It's the people who are carrying the jugs of water on the trips,
Right.
right? I mean, typically servants, right? Slaves. And so thinking about that too, Cancer is a water sign
Mm-hmm.
in the sixth house. Like the service is I carry water,
Mm.
and it's I would imagine carrying a clay jug full of water would be fucking heavy. It
Yeah.
does not sound like something I want to do for a miles long trip. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's yeah, there is this sort of like trudging care, you know, like
Mm.
I'm just gonna keep showing up. I'm just gonna keep caring in these very tangible ways.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is going off, but I'm just reminded about I don't know if the statistic is true, but it's like water access in Africa and how important infrastructure, how important education is for young women or just young people in general, but how it's like I'm just reminded of this idea of young girls like carrying water as like a hindrance for them to get an education or like doing kind of
Mm,
certain like certain kind of like sustaining labor as a hindrance to education, which is a hindrance to globally advancement. Like there's a global goal at the UN to provide a certain level of education for children.
oh,
And part of that means, and this is where Aquarius can come in, I think, with the connections to infrastructure. It's like if a village or what have you has like a pump and they don't have to walk a mile to get water, that frees up people to put their energy elsewhere
yeah,
for their advancement. So yeah, it's interesting.
yeah. Oh, I don't think that's like far afield at all. It like totally makes sense with that the first and sixth house aversion, and you know, to be laboring and toiling kind of inherently takes away from the ability to develop and express the self.
Mm-hmm.
And so really see that relationship play out between Aquarius and Cancer, yeah, in that chart. And yeah, I think too, like Aquarius infrastructure and also maybe like education, information, technology,
Mm-hmm.
right? Those sorts of things, all
Right. It's like,
being expressions of that sign.
yeah, because it's like what is the jug but techne? It's a piece of technology to
Right.
move water from one place to another.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Yeah. All right. How about Pisces rising and Cancer fifth house?
Yeah. I I just think of Pisces rising people as just deeply devoted, like in their love. I mean, it I'm sure that it would, I guess I don't know too many folks with Pisces rising who have children,
Mm,
um, or even necessarily like long-term committed partners, but there's this devotion to the people they love that
mm,
feels very fifth house Cancer, right? And it's,
yeah.
um, this is having Jupiter as a ruling planet again, right? So I think, Jupiter in Cancer, and Austin Coppock talks about Jupiter in Cancer as being sustainable community, sustainable
Mm,
mutuality. I think of someone like Sam Reynolds, who
mm-hmm,
has Pisces rising, and being at Norwalk and having become his friend in the last year to people, and how much he's given to people, and how devoted he is to the astrological community. I mean, yeah, there's this
mm-hmm,
like showing up and really giving a shit, like in a
mm.
deep way.
Yeah, I thanked Sam when I launched this podcast, but I just want to like say I probably wouldn't be doing this podcast if it weren't for Sam, because I got a reading with him pretty early on. He was one of the first people I got a reading from, and he kind of like suggested that I do my own podcast because I've been working professionally in podcasting for a while, and this kind of came as a result of that. So I really appreciate the impact that Sam has had on my life. And yeah, I think that's really, I can definitely see that. I'm also reminded of a past guest, Kira Taborn, who has Pisces rising, and
Mm.
she has the moon in Aries in the second. And she is, I think, one of the only guests I've had that's spoken about, she doesn't have children, but she's spoken about like the importance of her someday having children, and kind of
Mm.
like the idea of parenthood for her as kind of like a resource. Again, thinking about the second house and the moon in the second house, it's like that seems like a really motivating and supportive thing for her to envision and imagine. And it's so, yeah, it's really interesting to hear, or to reflect on the fifth house and its association with children, and how that can manifest for some Pisces risings.
Right. And even thinking about folks who don't have necessarily have like biological children, like Sam, right? And sort of being a parental figure for a
Yeah.
lot of people, being a mentor, and someone that, you would really feel like cares for you in a way that a parent might, like that, having
Hmm.
your best interest at heart and really taking time to. Pisces have such like so soulful eyes, right? And this sort
Mm,
of like just like gazing to the like the depths of your being, and yeah, like a penetrating gaze, and holding space for you.
mm,
Very Cancerian.
it's beautiful. All right. How about Aries? And yeah, again, this really interesting Martial rising sign with the fourth house being Cancer, the house of parents and home, and ancestry and legacy. There's like a really interesting tension between these two signs.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think of some of the Aries rising folks I know and their deep attachment to their fathers, or like,
Mm,
like I took care of my dad when he was dying, that sort of thing. And with kind of an emphasis on fathers, maybe even more so than mothers, which is an interesting pattern to me. Maybe not necessarily universally true, of course. But yeah, having these deep connections to home. And I think, I don't know, maybe there's a psychic quality to Aries risings of like really needing a home base, but at the same
mm,
time, really needing the freedom to depart from that home
yeah.
base, again bringing that martial quality of like independence, where I
Hmm.
think the Scorpio rising, that Mars manifests as sort of like leave me alone, like I'm just doing my own thing, whereas Aries is like I need to go out, I need to
Hmm.
like depart
Yeah.
and learn some things for myself. But I always want, like, don't sell the house, like, don't
Hmm.
sell the house by the river. I need to come back there,
Mm,
from time to time to like remember who I am.
mm,
And there's that memory again. Like I need to, I think the fourth house is can sometimes refer to our internal sense of home, right?
Mm,
Like our internal compass in a way, and like what we carry with us that roots us. And I see having Cancer in the fourth house is really needing to like physically go home to be reminded of who you are,
mm,
which I think is like part of the hero's journey, right? Is like the
yeah.
return home. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting thinking about the houses a little bit more psychologically, with the fourth house being kind of the lowest house in the chart, and its connection with that potentially with being like maybe the most kind of internal, or the place that other people don't get to see as readily because of that.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
All right. Yeah, how about the next rising sign, Taurus rising?
Yeah.
And this, if
I
I may, really quickly, I just want to
yeah.
say, preface this with like, this is another really interesting rising sign, because the third house is Cancer and the joy of the moon is the third house. So, yeah, that's just a really interesting kind of like inherent structure to the Taurus rising and their chart, that kind of the place where the moon joys is the place that the moon rules.
Yeah. I think that this is just like Taurus risings have this like you could sit on the front porch or on the stoop with them and just like hang out.
Hmm.
There's this neighborly quality to Taurus risings of like, yeah, like I know everyone in the neighborhood, like we're good, we hang out, that sort of thing. There's this level of like approachability and comfort. I was looking, I think like both Miley Cyrus and Queen Latifah, if I'm not mistaken, like both have Taurus rising, and
Hmm.
thinking of this sort of strong sense of like culture. And I do things like the way that my neighbors do it. I do things like the way that when we grew up, there's this sort of like around the way girl kind of
Uh-huh.
essence to Taurus rising, I think, and a commitment to those lateral connections of like siblings and neighbors, and yeah, the place where I grew up.
Hmm. And now, last but not least, how about Gemini risings and Cancer in the second house?
I was really chuckling thinking about this because the Gemini risings that I know, of course, are just sort of like very chatty. There's a Cancerian essence does like typically not come through a Gemini
Mm,
rising unless they have like major placement in Cancer. That's been my experience. But I started looking at, yeah, like who are celebrities that have Gemini rising, and might I be able to like get some data from that? And I found, and I did not like super confirm these birth times, but I think Lady Gaga and Will Smith both have Gemini
mm,
rising. And I was thinking about how, the second house can be a lot about like how we resource ourselves. I think about it as like personal power can come in the second house, and how both Lady Gaga and Will Smith have written these songs that are really like self-empowering, right? Or just like
mm.
empowering others. And I really had a laugh because we had a youth group member this was years ago, and she and I are now friends because she's like well into adulthood, but um, she wrote a self-worth song,
Oh,
and she
cool.
taught it to the whole youth group, and there were like hand motions and everything. And she like was at summer camp or something and wrote it and taught it to the youth group, and then for years at like every gathering we would sing the self-worth song, and to the point where it was like it almost like tormented her because she was
Oh my
like, I'm sorry
gosh.
I ever but it was very playful, and she played along because Gemini rising, of course. So
Hmm.
um but I mean, to this day we still make self-worth song references, in like our group chat or whatever with all the kids from the youth group, and it's just so funny. And I was like, wow, there really is this um like I care for myself. I'm gonna like pump myself up. I'm gonna lift up other people. Like this is how I show care through empowerment. And so I think
Hmm.
that empowering others or oneself is a really good Gemini rising Cancer in the second house
Yeah.
expression.
It's interesting when you look at celebrity charts, because it's like, how much can we know of these people and their private lives, you know? And I say that
Mm.
in the context of my mom actually has Gemini rising, and so the Cancer is
Mm.
her second house, and she also has the moon in Sag like me. But I really see parenthood as like a support for her, like something that
Mm.
is like a resource for her own identity, and
Mm.
and I think that that might be it's really interesting because I think that even in like growing up, um, people would see my mom in a way that I wouldn't see her because of like the relationship that we had. And it's just kind of interesting how people can be different in different contexts, and only in certain contexts you can kind of see into a person's reality or personality or what have you. And so it's interesting to think about like parenthood potentially, or I don't know, motherhood as like a resource for
Mhm.
certain Gemini risings.
Yeah. Many of the Gemini risings I know are sort of the ones that like are they herald the family, right? Like they're like,
Mm-hmm.
everybody, we need to, go bowling together or whatever.
Uh-huh.
And they sort of like round everyone up. And yeah, it does seem like a sort of way of resourcing the self, is like, I need to get the family together, we need to have time. Or even if it's chosen family, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
we need to get the gang together, and there's often an activity involved, right?
Right.
And we're gonna do this thing, which feels very Gemini.
Mm-hmm.
We're gonna do trivia or whatever. But yeah, there really is this gathering element
Mm-hmm.
of Gemini
Mm-hmm.
risings, I think, of their families.
Yeah. And it's really interesting too how like the mutable air nature and like the kind of gathering nature of the mutable and the social nature of the air kind of like so literally plays into that. With Gemini risings, they like use their skill of kind of like being those little social pollinators to kind of get everybody together.
Yeah, yeah, so cute. I just love Gemini risings.
Yeah.
I mean, I
Yeah.
love all the risings, but Gemini, they're just fun. You're in for
Hmm.
a good time if you're going to hang out with a Gemini
Yeah,
rising.
absolutely. All right. I think that we did it with the rising signs. Is there any additional thoughts that you'd like to
Yeah.
share before we wrap up?
My last thought is that the Thema Mundi has Cancer rising,
Hmm.
and I think that's philosophically really important, when we're talking about the sign and when we're thinking about astrology, particularly traditional astrology as a practice. That there's some sort of essence of self, of the cosmos, that's Cancerian in nature,
Mm,
and I just think that's great food for thought.
yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. And yeah, I've definitely thought about that before. And I feel like there's a lot to think about in relation to that, especially as like the Cancer rising relates to the dignity scheme and everything and how it all kind of like fits together geometrically and whatnot. So that's something I'm definitely going to consider.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much for coming on, Lindsay. It's been a pleasure meeting you and talking with you about this. Where can we find you? And is there anything that you're working on that you want to tell us about?
Thank you so much. It's likewise been a really fun chat for me. Yeah, so I'm on Instagram at bad.pastor, Twitter at bad_pastor_, and my website is badpastor.me. So I offer webinars 2 to 3 times a month, just teaching on various subjects on the sun season that we're in, and other things that interest me. I teach a lot on intersections of Christianity and astrology,
Mm,
which I personally find very exciting. And I think the community that finds that fun is growing and connecting. One expression of that is this group Star Pals that I started, which meets twice a month, before the new moon, and also we do a month ahead forecast. And it's sliding scale. It starts at $1. I just want people to be able to gather and really do astrology in community, because I think
mm,
astrology is a practice that too often happens in isolation, and it's really cool to just have a community that meets and gets to talk about what's going on in their lives, how's that showing up in the transits in the lunar cycle, right? And then, of course, I offer one-on-one services, so chart consultations, spiritual accompaniment, and I also do ritual consultation for large and small public and private events.
amazing. Okay. And we decided, or like we, you reached out to me to be on the podcast, and then I saw that you were doing this this webinar that you did recently. Do you want to kind of plug that? Because it goes in a little bit more in depth to the stuff that we were talking about today.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be a great complement to this conversation because I did not go in depth into like cancer in the houses, but I do just sort of do an overview of cancer and the moon, some of the classical significations, and a sort of reframing from sensitivity to responsiveness. It's available for purchase on my website at badpastor.me, and I post lots of webinars up there for purchase. So
awesome.
Yeah,
I'll be sure to link that.
me.
Yep, absolutely. All right. Thank you again, Lindsey. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, SP. This was great.
To support the show by donating or becoming a member, please visit my website, which is linked in the show notes. And please subscribe to the show wherever you listen. You can also find me on Instagram and Twitter. See those links in the show notes as well. If you have any questions or feedback on the show, please feel free to contact me via my website or email me at sphallhorary@gmail.com. In the show notes, you can also find links to astrologers and resources that we touched on in this episode. Thanks. See you next time.